previous seminar. So we have Young Jen standing in front of us, who's going to tell us all about mass-asymmetric fission across the nuclear chart.
Thanks very much, David. As David said, I'll be talking about exactly what's behind me, and I'm hoping that we'll all be intimately familiar with each part of this platform. Has anyone got any problems with me recording this meeting on Zoom? Same goes for Zoom. If anyone has anything, just shout to me and I'll stop. That's great. Okay, so let's go through an overview of what I want to talk about today. So first I want to go through, well, what is fission and how was it discovered? I then want to go through and explain the underlying mechanisms that dictate the outcomes of fission, or at least our current understanding of them. And then I'll go through a detailed study of the fission of bismuth nuclei at low energies, which is what I've done as part of my PhD. And then we'll move on to a wider systematic study in the sublab region, and hopefully if there's enough time, I'll talk about future work. So let's start off with what is fission and how is it discovered? So there's one quote I think that nicely encompasses all of this at once, and that is that nuclear fission is an extremely complex reaction. In the fission process, we're dealing with a cataclysmic rearrangement of a single nucleus into two nuclei. So most of us would probably think of a simple picture of fission, which is something like this. You have a single system which naturally breaks apart into two similar mass fragments. And hopefully by the end of this talk, I'll prove that actually it's a much more complex reaction, as is suggested by this quote. Okay, so how do we discover something like this? It's a cataclysmic reaction. Doesn't sound very safe to study in the research now. So how do they do this? Well, let's look at our standard nuclear physicist. Our standard nuclear physicist is just looking at the nucleus and going, give me information. We want to prod, probe, and interrogate the nucleus to give us information about itself. And the way we usually do that is we smash things together at high speed. That's how I describe myself as a nuclear physicist. And that's exactly what they were doing in the 1930s. Instead of our usual stick here, the particular stick of choice was a neutron beam, and our target choice of nucleus to be interrogated was uranium-238. So, what happens? If you fire a neutron beam at uranium-238, what happens? Well, you hope that the neutron will be absorbed and create uranium-239. If this happens, you then produce the uranium-239 nucleus in an excited state. And then we want to see, well, what happens? How does this nucleus proceed from this point? So, in the 1930s, they were seeing what happens from this particular state, and they found that barium was being produced. Now, this was particularly surprising because no one could think, oh, well, how could a measly neutron split apart a massive nucleus as big as uranium? But after extensive chemistry by Otto Hahn, he conclusively and unequivocally proved that barium was indeed being produced. So if we're producing barium, we must also be producing another fragment. And if we conserve the proton number, we'll then produce a krypton nucleus. And I'll come back to this in a minute. Now, this won the Nobel Prize in Chemistry in 1944, not in physics. So I want to talk about the physics behind it and also the most important person to explaining the physics behind it, and that is Bismuth magnet. Well, the reaction, yeah, so I mean, it was probably going to be neutron emission to uranium-235 and fission, but the actual reaction was just a neutron onto uranium-238. Does that answer your question? Check that reference and then I can tell you. Okay, well, okay. Okay, anyway, let's go back to Lisa Meitner. She's important. So, whilst Otto Hahn won the Nobel Prize for Chemistry by himself, it was actually Lisa Meitner who was the one who explained the physics behind it. Meitner and their cousin Frisch worked out immediately that the uranium nucleus must have broken apart in some sort of way, and they were the ones that termed it nuclear fission. They took this from the fissioning of a single cell in biology to two different cells. So, while she might not have a Nobel Prize, she does have an element which I think is a little bit more fancy, a little bit cooler. I think that's a good way to honour someone who's that important to the nuclear fission understanding. Okay, great. So we have got some sort of fission process. Nuclei can be broken apart. Let's go back to this uranium-235 nucleus that's going to be broken. And what I said before is that we're producing a uranium-235 nucleus at an excited state. And what I mean by an excited state is the neutron has been absorbed has imparted energy to this new nucleus that's been created. Importantly, this has enough energy so that the system can undergo fission. It has enough energy to overcome what is called the fission barrier. And that will be important as I go later on. Okay, so what do we use to study nuclear fission as a physicist? We don't really want to have to do detailed chemistry each time to try and find out what fragments are being produced. And is it just barium and krypton that's being produced from this breaking part, or are there other things being measured as well? And that's what we can do. We can measure this in efficient mass distribution. And these really are one of the best experimental tools that we have to investigate the fission process. And these are quite straightforward. These just show the yield for a given fragment mass, either in terms of mass ratio, or in this case, mass number. And this is against cross-section, which you consider as just number of counts or yield. They're all equivalent. Okay, so straight away, we can see there is a distribution of elements produced. We're not just producing barium and krypton, we're producing a wide range of nuclei in this reaction. But where would barium and krypton come in? Where would they come in? Well, on the mass distribution, they come here. They relate to the peaks of the mass distribution. And for example, if we move further away into a slightly more mass-asymmetric region, we see, say, if we make a lutetium nucleus, we then also make a complementary nucleus of scandium as well. Great. So that's plenty of information that we can get. We can see that there's a very complex reaction process that's occurring, and there is a distribution of fission fragments that are produced. And I want to draw attention straight away that this is a two-peak structure. As we can see clearly that barium and krypton are not of equal mass. They are substantially different. Barium is much heavier than krypton. So when you see a two-peak structure, I want you to think immediately mass-asymmetric fission. That's the trigger word. Okay, so what about other nuclei? We're bored of uranium-235 by now. We're bored of it, we want to move on. Let's see what other nuclei can fission, how they can fission. So we can't have a nuclear physics talk without a picture of a nuclear chart. So of course we have our x-axis is of course neutron number, and our y-axis is proton number. All these colored points, don't worry about the label, are just isotopes that have fission mass distributions measured. So first of all, I want to point out that we can see there is one quite distinct trend here, empirically, that we go from a very strongly mass-asymmetric fission modes over here towards more mass-symmetric fission as we reduce in mass. And not only this, we can see there's a significant complexity if we look just along the same isotopic chain. Just by changing the neutron number by a few neutrons, we can see that the mass distribution changes substantially. So the question remains, well, why do the distributions change so dramatically? What is behind all of this? And that's where we move on to the next part of the talk, where hopefully we'll go through the underlying mechanisms that dictate the outcomes of fission. Now, I think every one of us is a nuclear physicist in here. So the answer to most problems in nuclear physics, and also the cause of many problems in nuclear physics, is of course shell effects. Shell effects are the answer. We've done it. Let's move on. But what do I actually mean when I say shell effects in the terms of the fission process? Well, I mean that when a fission fragment has a certain number of proton and or neutrons, it can have an increased stability. So many of us are familiar with a very stable nucleus that is 232, and that is stable. It has 50 protons and 82 neutrons. Of course, these are magic numbers, and therefore this is a doubly magic nucleus. Anyway, so the point is that with the proton numbers being full magic shells, there is an increased stability of the nucleus, such as here. And importantly, the arrangement of neutrons in the nucleus determines its shape. So shape is important, and I'll come back to that in a minute, as when we think about how the fissioning nucleus can break apart. Okay, great. So can we say something about this? Can we say that, well, there's very strong stabilizing effects from, say, a doubly magic 10 nucleus, or at least these magic closed shells of protons and neutrons? It may be responsible for the observed fission mass distributions. Is this causing one of the nuclei to gain stability and then break apart? Well, there is one way to answer this, and that is to measure the proton and neutron numbers in the fission fragments themselves, and to track and see how these change and how these correlate with unknown shell effects. Now, this is where experimental systematics comes in. Now, I'm going to be running, whoever guesses the number of times I say the word experimental systematics, it's a free bottle of cordial. So it's a big prize. So I'll be saying it a lot. Okay, so let's look at some experimental systematics. So this is a bunch of reactions that were measured by Karl-Heinz Schmidt and others at GSI. And they measured a wide range of mass distributions from uranium all the way through to astatine and over a very large range of neutron number as well. Great, systematics, we love them. But what sort of information can we extract from systematic studies and from just simple individual mass distributions that's shown here? Well, what information we want to extract is we want to work out what fission modes are present. So, for example, if we look at the fission mass distribution of protactinium, one that's measured at ANU and analyzed by Berryman, we can see that to actually correctly reproduce this structure, we need a 5 Gaussian fit. This means there are 3 different modes of fission that are occurring in this distribution. I'll come back to that in the next slide. The other thing that we want to get from these mass distributions, as I said, we want to determine the proton and neutron numbers in the fragments, in the peak yield of these fragments. So the way we can get all of this information is to fit the distribution. And I want to introduce that there was, before the year 2000, it was very well established that there are 2 different modes of asymmetric fission in actinide nuclei. And we're seeing that right here. We're seeing a very mass-asymmetric fission mode, shown by these 2 Gaussians here. And this is determined called the standard 1 fission mode. And then a slightly less mass-asymmetric, but still mass-asymmetric fission mode called standard 2. And also in this distribution, we still see a separate symmetric fission component. There is a very complex mixture of different modes going on.
I want to ask you a question about that, just playing devil's advocate. Looking at that data, how do you know there's 2 peaks in there? They just look like they could be fit.
What? Sorry, these 2 peaks filling this one big peak. Well, so I go back to the point that it's well established that there are 2 asymmetric modes. So if you previously looked at other data in high statistics in the actinide region, it's consistent that you always require an extra set of Gaussians that's asymmetric. And I think
there are some that have a bump on the shoulder.
Yeah, I think so. And also in this case, I think Annette's done the fitting here and has highlighted as well that you get a much better statistical fit with this extra mode present. Okay. Right. So let's think about these 2 different mass asymmetric fission modes, and we want to see what the proton and neutron numbers are in the fission fragments. So that's what was done by Oxide and others. They determined the mean position of the proton and neutron numbers of the heavy fragment. Now, remember the color scheme? Standard 1 was blue and standard 2 was red. That's the same principle here. We're seeing that there are 2 different asymmetric fission modes that are different colors here. So on this plot, we're seeing the position of the proton number and neutron number against the mass of the fissioning compound system. First of all, we can see that there is a very strong correlation with proton number across a wide mass range. But we don't see the same principle with our neutron number. And if we bring in the n equals 82 closed shell, we see there's no correlation with this magic number. And this is important. The fact that these 2 mass-asymmetric fission modes are both occurring in different proton numbers means that we can't just use our spherical shell effects in a tin or z equals 50 to explain these 2 distributions. So that tells us that there must be other shell effects present. There must be other shell effects that are responsible for this. Okay, so to try and think about what other shell effects can be present, let's have a think about how a fission nucleus looks like. Okay, so the good thing about this is that I don't have to draw any nice diagrams because our very own Cedric Simonal and Gilon Scamps has actually done it for me. If we have a look at a single nucleus that's being broken apart in the fission process, we can think of it simply as a system that is going through elongation. As this elongates and gets further and further apart, a neck is formed where mass is being transferred, and eventually this neck will break apart. But one key thing that I want to point out is that just before it breaks apart, as shown by Cedric's talk last week, we see that a pear shape is formed. Every single time before a nucleus fissions apart, one of the nuclei is formed into a pair. Now, can we invoke any shell effects that give stability to pair shapes? Now, I want to mention before I go on to the next slide that when I say pair shapes, the experts in the room, that means I mean octopole correlations or octopole deformations. Okay, so again, thank you to Scamps and Simonal. We have an example for this. We can have a look at how these shell gaps evolve with elongation. Now, this plot is the single particle proton proton single particle energy plot on the y-axis, and on the x-axis we have the quadrupole moment on the bottom and the octupole moment on the top. To explain this, I want to think first of all as the quadrupole moment as simply an elongation system. Okay, so what we can do is when we start off with our large energy gap at 50 protons here, we see that that shrinks as we pull the system further and further apart. And crucially, when we then introduce our octupole deformation parameter, or as I like to call it, the pairosity of the system, we can see that our spherical shell gap actually evolves into a different deformed shell gap at different proton numbers, 56 protons and 52 protons. So let me remind you that we saw two groupings of our proton number here. We saw at 55 and 52.5. So maybe this work by Scatterton actually is a solution to explain why there are two different groupings of proton number from the two different octupole deformed shell gaps. And this is, I want to also bring attention to the fact that this was actually a very recent discovery. It was only in 2018. So 80 years after fission was discovered, we're finally kind of thinking, well, actually, if we think of the shape of the nucleus at fission, maybe we get some more information. So let me quickly summarize what we have understood about actinide fission. So what do we think drives mass-asymmetric fission in the actinide region? Well, we know that shell effects are crucial and they dictate when the fragments break apart and therefore dictate the mass split due to their increased stability. And we know that shell effects are also responsible for the shape of the fission fragments, or at least for the increased stability of certain shapes. And that we found that deformed shell effects are indeed crucial. Both quadrupole and octupole shell effects can be present in the nuclei. Okay, great. So we've understood fission. I don't know why I'm talking about this for my PhD project. And great, that's going back to our picture. We filled in this nice heavy region over here. Now, I wasn't particularly truthful with you earlier. I had two little lies on this slide. First of all, I mentioned that this is a nice smooth transition from mass-asymmetric fission to symmetric fission. But I'm sure as we have nitpicking people in the audience, they'll think, oh, that's not, this study in 201, that's not mass-symmetric, that's quite clearly mass-asymmetric. I would agree. But when these exploratory searches were done in this region near lead, people weren't interested. They were mostly focused on all the interesting stuff going on in the actinide region. So there's actually a quote from a paper, not on thallium, but on another nucleus, that says, oh, this is simply the asymmetry of symmetric fission. What? I just call that asymmetric fission. But anyway, it was kind of swept under the rug. It was considered a tail end effect of the actinide fission region.
This is all spontaneous fission?
No, so there's particle induced, there's electromagnetic induced, these are delayed fission and transfer induced fission. Yeah, so they're arranged so that colour and coordinated.
Oh, okay. So
the systematic study that I showed earlier was all this region here in the green. That was kind of like a big brand new region they explored. But yeah, spontaneous fissions, I don't think I actually showed.
What's the green say? I can't really.
EM induced, so electromagnetic induced. Yeah. Neutron or proton? No.
So it doesn't mean that
in the actinide region, I'm pretty sure I can say with 99% certainty it's just neutrons or protons. You don't need heavy ions to induce fission in this region.
What about the light ones then?
Well, getting to that. Well, most of the light ones on this particular plot and for this 2018 review paper were using proton-induced reactions still on just stable targets. All right, so the other white lie that I showed and didn't talk about is that I actually hid one piece of data from this plot. And this is a particularly important discovery. It was in 2010, and it was the discovery of mercury-180 having dominantly mass-asymmetric fission. This completely blows apart our idea of having a smooth transition from asymmetric to symmetric fission. We're seeing mass-asymmetric fission, dominantly so, miles away from the actinide region. So this brings out a lot of questions. First of all, is this asymmetric fission related to the actinide fission nuclei? Is it the same driving effects? Is there a common thing between these asymmetric fission fragments? And again, well, the only way to find out is experimental systematic studies in this region. And in particular, we really require low excitation energies to really probe the shell effects that are responsible for mass-asymmetric fission. And when I mean excitation energies, I mean the energy above the fission barrier. So we want to have a look at a system where we've nudged it just over the fission barrier, but not too high above that to wash out these shell effects and miss out on the influence of these shell effects. Because that's what happened before. These studies that were done in the 1980s were done at quite high excitation energy. So even though you're seeing some sort of inference of mass-asymmetric fission or asymmetry of symmetric fission, we're actually not seeing any mass-asymmetric fission in, say, iridium-187. And to conclusively say we're not seeing mass-asymmetric fission in a nucleus, we have to go down to the fission barrier. Okay, so one place to do this study is in between the transition region between the mass-asymmetric actinides and the mass-asymmetric mercury. And one of the nuclei that fits in nicely here is bismuth. And that's where we go on to the next part of the talk. So that's exactly what we did. So we have thankfully published this work already, and that's great. And we can, first of all, explain how do we study the fission of bismuth. Now, we used proton bombardment of lead targets. So same principle as the neutron bombardment of uranium earlier. We are causing the proton to be absorbed or to cause a fusion reaction. And when you cause this fusion reaction, you produce your bismuth nucleus at an excitation energy. And the great thing about protons at the ANU is that we can get our energies just at the fission barrier for bismuth. Bismuth's fission barrier is around 205 to 209, the isotopes, is around 22 to 24 MeV calculated. So we can tune our beam to just the target, just at the barrier and just above, and we can then track these changes with energy. And that's what we did. We used beams of protons from, of course, our lovely accelerator across the road, and we bombarded lead targets of 204, 206, and 208. And we then measure our fission fragments in the Q spectrometer. So just to highlight what this means, I mean, the proton beam comes in here, it hits our target, it causes a fusion reaction, the bismuth nuclei is produced, which then fissions immediately, and we then measure the fission fragments in our detectors. From our detectors, we get timing and positional information, and of course from that, we can determine the velocities. And from the velocities, we can then determine the mass ratio. So this is how we determine our masses of our fragments. Now, the mass ratio is, of course, just the mass of one fragment over the total mass of the system. But what I'm going to be talking about, and most studies in fission are looking at, not in terms of mass ratio, but in terms of atomic mass. So we can convert that quite simply with this nice, simple equation. And that's as much maths I'm going to show today. Okay, so what do we see? Oh, sorry, of course, I've got to show a nice pretty picture. I'm an experimentalist. I've got to show a nice pretty picture of our lovely detectors here. And of course, the proton beam comes in this direction and hits target ladder that will be situated from here. Okay, so where do we start? As I said, there were a few exploratory searches done in the 1980s in the sub-lead region or around lead. And one of them was by Itkis and others. He was the one who came up with the term asymmetric or symmetric fission, the asymmetry of mass-asymmetric fission. Because he kind of thought, well, okay, it's a tail end effect. And that's because he only measured up to, down to energies of 10 MeV above the barrier. And I would compare our results, which these are our highest measured energies that we have. Okay, so I mean, I think we can all agree that's great. They were perfectly a match, and that's fantastic. Great, we can move on. But the most important thing is that we're clearly seeing in our data and also in Itkis' data that there is a clear mass asymmetry. There is a dip in yield at mass symmetry. Okay, so some of you might be thinking, oh, well, what does our new study show? We've already kind of measured bismuth and we kind of see it fissions mass asymmetrically, who cares? Well, we go significantly lower in energy than has been measured before, and that gives us information like this. So hopefully we can all be happy to see that we see a significant dip in the yield at mass symmetry, and we can, oh, sorry, we see a significant dip in yield at mass symmetry as we decrease excitation energy. So, I mean, if we saw this in the 1980s, if they measured this energy, they can't possibly describe this as anything other than mass-asymmetric fission, or at least dominantly mass-asymmetric fission. Okay, so how do we extract information? Going back to, say, the protactinium plot with the 5 Gaussians, we want to get the proton numbers, neutron numbers, and fission modes. They're the things that we care about. Great. The way we do this, oh, whoa, I've cut out a slide. The way we do this is, of course, we fit the data. So most of us will be thinking, oh, great, well, double Gaussian fit, it's probably going to be great, it's just going to be purely mass asymmetric. Wrong. What you actually see is if you use a double Gaussian fit, using purely mass asymmetric fission, we see that there's a significant dip in symmetry yield compared to the data, and the peak positions are also shifted inwards. And to further prove my point, the residuals here, which is obviously the difference between the fit and the data point. There's a clear structure, and many data points are not even in error on the zero. So how can we fix a fit? Well, of course, we add a Gaussian. We can keep adding Gaussians forevermore. But if we only add one more Gaussian, we add a Gaussian at mass symmetry here, and therefore we have a mass-asymmetric and mass-symmetric fission mode present. We see that there's a much better fit to the data, especially at mass symmetry. And that is also highlighted in the residual plot. The residuals are significantly closer to zero with very minimal structure in the residuals as well. So, if you're not convinced, I've shown them both in the same plot as well, just to highlight how bad a double Gaussian fit actually is. Right, so we can fit the data. We need 3 Gaussians, great. So let's fit all of our data for all of our Bismuth reactions that we measured. Fantastic. Now, hopefully we can agree on 2 things. 1, these are very pretty plots. And 2, that we have a clear increase in symmetric fission yield as we go up in energy, as we were seeing in the data, but again, our nice fits also highlight that. Importantly, they highlight that in a quantitative way. We can determine the amount of symmetric fission for a given energy. And that's what we call a symmetric fission fraction. And that's shown here. So on the y-axis, we have the symmetric fission fraction, and on the x-axis, we have the energy above the calculated fission barrier. So, of course, we see a decrease in the amount of symmetric fission that we see with decreasing energy. We could have seen that from the data itself with the dip symmetry quite clear. But importantly, this actually highlights a very important thing is that, well, the reason this is important is that it's showing that actually it suggests that the fission barrier for, say, the asymmetric fission mode is actually at a lower energy than the symmetric fission mode. That's why we're accessing the symmetric fission mode more and more as we increase the energy of the system. Okay, so we've got a little bit more information from this plot, but the way that we can really get information from this and we can make an important point is to compare it to a theoretical calculation. So let's look at something known as GEF, the General Description of Fission Observables model. Now, this is a semi-empirical model, and the reason I've compared it here is that it works incredibly well in the Actinide region, mostly because there's a lot of data in the Actinide region. Semi-empirical models require that, but more importantly, they have got some data. For example, the value 201 data I showed, which had that little mass asymmetry, they do try and fit their model to that data. Even with this, we can clearly see that the GEF calculations severely underestimate the reduction in symmetric fission yield as we decrease the excitation energy. And this was only possible to really kind of highlight this glaring error and issue with the GEF code because we went to these low energies. So hopefully that highlights the importance of these low excitation energy studies in this fission. Now, of course, that's not the only thing that I want to talk about. The only thing we want to get out of from the fission distributions, we of course want to get the proton and neutron numbers in the fragments. And that's what we'll do. So,
Can I ask you a question on that? Do you think there's a real difference for the Bismuth 209? I mean, the 2 isotopes would kind of.
Bismuth 209, yeah. So, yeah, no, I would agree. I mean, within error, you can't say there's much difference between them. But if we go back to the Bismuth 209, we only measured at 2 energies, and our statistics is not particularly high in these measurements.
Was that just because you didn't have the lean time, or it was hard, or something?
I mean, this was something we did in my master's. I think it was the fission.
Impurity in the layer.
Yeah, I think so.
So actinide impurity in the layer. It's too much of it, and it forms the low probability of fission and the fusion of the Bismuth. So layer was not as good a target. That's falls to S.
Yeah, so I actually deliberately ignored bringing the impurity plot for some reason, don't know why. But yeah, that's probably the main reason. And also for all of these plots, even at the low energies, you're looking at really low cross sections around. So it does take a lot of time. So even with beam time across the road, it does take a long time to just get relatively low statistics like this.
The other point here, this is calculated. This is with respect to the calculated barrier. So that calculated barrier was incorrect.
Yeah.
Systematic.
Yeah.
So yeah, one's got protons below that one. I guess they're all totally.
They all have the same Z.
It's the neutrons.
Yeah, the neutrons.
Opposite sides.
Yeah.
Since you mentioned the calculated barrier, I mean, I was wondering how is it calculated? You already mentioned two different.
Yeah.
So which one do you use? What and how does that?
So the calculations, so I didn't do the calculations of the Fission barriers. They're done by Peter Muller, and that's to basically generate a random walkover of a potential energy surface. And they can determine the Fission barriers. No, that's not how to do it. Peter Muller is the one who's determined these Fission barriers. I haven't quite worked.
So
No, it's not the large stuff.
The macroscopic.
Yeah. Yeah, sorry.
So he's just calculating a straight potential energy surface.
Yeah,
looking at the height of it.
And I mean, so the paper that you get it from is calculated like 3,000 nuclei, right? So it's I don't think he's fine-tooth combs checking every single nucleus as well. So I mean, I think there is a bit of wiggle room in the Fission barrier calculation here. So.
And does his calculation show the two barriers, and he's just taking the lower one?
I'm not sure.
I'm not sure.
I can. I think
It takes the lowest one.
Well, I guess that would be the highest probability mode as well. So that's probably what he's trying to get.
He fills it with potential energy surface with water down state. Looks at the level of water where it starts to come out.
So the level.
I'm not sure he will identify what mass-asymmetric jobs are released for all of them.
The original model that was called on the water.
Sorry?
The one with the water is the emerging model.
I guess it's probably called that. Yeah.
Anyway, yeah, good questions. I think I've talked to you afterwards. So let's go on to the determined proton and neutron numbers in our mass asymmetric peaks. Now, we can extract them from the fits, and we can extract them using the unchanged charge density assumption, just using a nice simple equation like this. And where Cn means the compound nucleus. So we're taking the bismuth proton number over the total number. So we're basically looking at the ratio of protons and neutrons in the compound system.
Earlier on, you said that you're only going to show one equation.
No! I was like, surely I can't get this equation wrong. Okay. Sorry, yeah, that's my third line of the talk. I'm sorry. Okay, right. Yes, it is. Now the point, thank you for asking that. I've got a question that I can answer. So the point is, when we worry about neutron evaporation, in our study, obviously we're looking at this from 0 to 10 MeV above the barrier. So it's been shown that from 8 MeV below, you're not really going to get evaporation. And if you do, you won't see a fission fragment because you will go below the fission barrier. So we don't. This is a pretty valid assumption in this study and for this energy range. Okay, so let's try and explain what this plot is actually showing. So of course we're showing the proton number in the peak, the mass asymmetric peak, and the neutron number against the energy above the barrier, and the hollow points are the heavy mass fragment, and the light points are the light mass fragment. I'm sure most of you are asking, what are the colour bands for? What are they showing? Well, I have a slide ready for that. So these pink bands are corresponding to expected quadrupole deformed shell gaps, both in the light fragment at z equals 38, and in the heavy fragment, z equals 42, 44, and 46.
Different deformations.
Different deformations. Yeah. Yeah.
So the gaps are in different deformations.
Yes. Yeah. So yeah, they evolve with deformation. Yeah. And then for the neutron number, we go back to our octopole correlations. Remember that we were looking in the actinide region, we're looking at proton octopole shells. Here we're looking at neutrons at 52 and 56. Now, what information can we extract from this? Well, we can say, well, the proton numbers seem to be very nicely correlated with both z equals 38 and also z equals 45, maybe influenced by both the 44 and the 46. And then we've also got, someone can certainly make an argument, I'm sure Cedric would like to make an argument, that this is n equals 56, octopole, fantastic. We can probably assume that that's part of the reason for it as well. But which one of these, if there is one that's dominating, which one of them is dominating and how? And that, again, we need systematics. We need to increase our neutron number and proton numbers to check how these correlate over a large mass range, because obviously we're only looking at a single element. So any information we really take from, say, the proton number, it's difficult to make a conclusion from.
One other thing about this is that surely you can't have, for a given shape,
yeah,
you can't have two different shell gaps.
Exactly. So there has to be a single shell effect that is occurring, but we can't tell which one it is. Yeah. So that's why we need systematics to really track how these change, and we can then isolate individual shell effects and then say conclusively, oh, it's the quadrupole, oh, it's the octopole. That's it.
Can I ask you another question? Which is thinking about quadrupole deformations and octopole deformations at the same time, I mean separately, why couldn't the actual shape be some mixture of quadrupole and octopole
Well,
shape?
well, when you're seeing a fissioning nucleus, as is shown in like the single particle energy plot, you're seeing that you're elongating the system and you're increasing its quadrupole moment, and then you introduce your octopole correlation as well. So I guess that kind of already is a mixture, but I would probably pass that question more to someone. Yeah, so that, yeah, thank you. Yeah, so when we're seeing the fragments that are being formed just before the fission occurs, we're seeing pear shapes. So we're hoping that that shape will always be occurring, and that could be the reason why.
Have you ever seen a paper where, you showed Nielsen diagram there, right? So you take your harmonic add a quadrupole to the fusion, and then I guess you're adding an octopole to it. Have you ever seen somebody turn them both on at the same time?
No. Well, yeah, sorry, yeah, no, that isn't a diagram. We
They are both that was on at the same time. I thought one was on the left and one was on the right.
No, so I can go back.
No, that's all right.
No, it's fine. I can speak right. It's fine. I'll just talk quicker. It's fine. No problem. Right, where are we? Merry Christmas. So, okay, what we're seeing is the quadrupole moment purely along the x-axis all the way, and at halfway point we're then introduced. Cedric. So, but 7 are then increasing and including the octopole moment.
I looked at that.
Yeah.
But that's octopole on top of the.
Yes, on top of the quadrupole.
Yeah, I
Exactly.
that the right hand bit is the octopole, the left hand bit is the quadrupole. Although I was sort of half conscious that that wasn't compatible with what you said.
That's I think ferocity is not helping anyone. That's probably wrong.
It's not, I mean, time's in the problem, but it's not on that plot, right?
No. Anyway, I think I have a limited amount of time, so I want to.
That's all right. We're saving you for questions.
That doesn't count. All right, where were we? Yeah. So I was just about to say that we need. I'm going to say experimental systematics again. That's fantastic. Systematics. We need a wider range. So we can introduce this in a wider systematic study that's being formed at the ANU partly by myself, as a much wider range, and also by other people at the ANU as well. Now, this one, I promise you, has all the distributions that are supposed to be there. I'm not lying anymore. But what I'm showing is that we obviously haven't really explored this sub-led region. And that's what we want to explore. We really want to test and see what sort of fission modes we observe in this region and see how they compare with the Actinide region. So, how do we explore this new region? How can we generate nuclei that then fission and then measure their fission mass distributions over here? Well, as Greg mentioned earlier, we can actually use heavy ion reactions. We can use a reaction that fuses together. Say, for example, we take a beam of sulfur, we fire it at a target of tungsten. That comes together, fuses, and again, as I said before, it will have an excitation energy that's above its fission barrier and breaks apart. Well, you're probably thinking, well, Ben, you've been mentioning the great use about protons and low excitation energies. Why don't we use those? Well, partly because our accelerator can't reach the energies really required across the road, because when you're going down in mass, the fission barrier is continually increasing. And also, protons are only limited to stable nuclei, well, at least near stability. You have to have a good solid target to then irradiate. Okay, so heavy ion reactions, we can make new nuclei, but it does come with a drawback. Usually when you have a heavy ion induced reaction, you are going to be producing it at a higher excitation energy. So all of this information, all these things I've been saying about low excitation energy is very important. Does that translate to mean that we can't get any information from these higher excitation energy studies? Well, let's go back to the centroid plot. One of the things that we can take from this is that the centroids of the mass asymmetric peaks remain consistent with energy. The peaks stay in the same position. What we were seeing is that the most obvious thing that we were seeing in the distributions is the filling in of yield at mass symmetry. So surely we can still then be able to extract the relevant proton and neutron numbers from our distributions, but the distributions themselves, to the naked eye at least, might not look directly mass asymmetric. You'll probably have something that's either flat tops or peak symmetry. So that's what's been done. A project that I was part of has done this exact thing, where we did a systematic experimental study between osmium and lead. And, well, what do we find? Great, another paper, fantastic. What do we find? Well, we looked at the region, as I said, between lead and osmium, which is very close to our nice bismuth nuclei here, and we're extending into the lower mass region. Okay, so we've got loads of measured mass distributions. Great, fantastic. System edits, they're great. But this is only looking between the Z equals 76, so looking through osmium, all the way through increasing proton number to our lead. Now, this is creating lots of different reactions. We're seeing calcium-induced reactions. We also have one proton-induced reaction here, and also some carbon reactions and sulfur reactions. To try and make this picture a little bit easier to explain, let's zoom in on 4 mass distributions. The key thing here is that we can see that the blue peaks here, which is purely a single Gaussian symmetric fit, fails to fit all of our data. We are required to have a double Gaussian and therefore mass asymmetric peak to correctly reproduce our data. So even when we're producing these nuclei at high excitation energies, in something that to the naked eye looks, oh, well, it doesn't look obviously mass asymmetric, we can still extract that information about mass asymmetric fission mode with our fitting.
There's no symmetric component.
There's no symmetric component, exactly. So we're assuming, this study was assuming that you can only have 2 peaks, and it's very difficult to really be able to categorically say we need an extra fit because of the statistics. Realistically, you can't say, oh, well, our chi-squares might improve slightly, but you can't really invoke there's a logical reason for that, which is again.
Let me, there's, you know, sort of necessary and sufficient addition, something like, I'm sorry.
That's okay, that's fine.
You're acquitting yourself well done.
Just blaming other people, it's great.
You can fit it with 2, but you get a pretty good fit with 1. So presumably you can do it with 3 with reduced amplitude. Is that right? I mean, well, you really, you perhaps haven't got enough to
yeah. So you certainly could add an extra Gaussian and see how the fit would look. It probably would look even better, right? But I think, so again, that's what I mentioned, that this wasn't.
What I'm saying is, can you exclude the single case, really? The symmetric case?
So
single
peak, yes. Yeah. So the principle of why systematics are so powerful is that overall, over a very large range, we're seeing consistently that it cannot be actually reproducing it.
That's what I was looking for. Yeah.
Lovely. Okay, and I mean that's why we also have measured the proton on thallium to look at lead. If you look at the low energies where you really see if there is mass asymmetric fission there, then we have a clear proof that obviously a single Gaussian doesn't work. So one would expect that that would evolve smoothly across this region as well. And I also want to mention that I didn't do the fitting, so we can talk to Prasad. Okay, so of course, one thing that we always want to do with mass distributions is we want to determine the fission modes. We think we're happy with mass asymmetric. We also want to determine the proton and neutron numbers in our fragments. So that's exactly what we did. In this case, instead of having against the energy above the barrier, we're showing the proton number against the proton number of the compound nucleus that's fissioning. And again, same for the neutron number here as well. So one thing we can quickly say, and I have a little bit of time to talk about, is that we see a bit more of a correlation with proton number. There seems to be an influence on the formed fission fragments from the proton number, which maybe you can't quite see, but if you compare it to, say, the neutron number, there is no correlation. The neutron number smoothly transitions across this region. And this is kind of what seems to be the current understanding, with papers coming out very recently, kind of suggesting and seeming that it's a proton-dictated reaction again. Much like the actinide region, which is optical deformed proton shells, it seems that there seems to be different proton shell effects, but still dominated by proton number in this region as well. And that's the current understanding. But again, to really explain and really conclusively say if this is true or not, we need systematics. Sorry for saying it again. Yeah. And one last thing I want to talk about from this paper is that we can compare them directly to calculated yields and calculated proton numbers and neutron numbers of the fragments by our good friends, Scamps and Cedric Simulon. And the really good thing is, I'm not going to go into the details of the theory, but this is again using the idea of these pear shapes of fission. We're seeing that our data and the calculations match incredibly well. So, as I said, I haven't got time to go through this, but This gives a really good support for both the calculations that have been done and also the fact that we can get very useful and important information for mass-asymmetric fission using heavy ion-induced reactions. Okay, great. So just to quickly wrap up a little bit. So this is obviously which I showed where lead is, and this is where the paper that I just showed study was focused on. In my PhD, I was showing and analysing data in these green points here, covering this entire range and beyond. And these green boxes are only referencing reactions where we have induced with a sulfur beam. So we measured sulfur on cadmium all the way from sulfur to tungsten. Okay, so let's quickly look at the very preliminary discussion and preliminary results, as we can see there. Okay, just to make sure we're all happy as preliminary, that's great. So what we can see is that actually what's been analysed so far is that we're going from 64 protons in the compound nucleus all the way through to 90 protons. We're covering a very large range. Another thing that we can see is that we're actually seeing quite strongly double-peaked mass-asymmetric fission even at these higher station energies, which is quite interesting. And there's two things I really want to take from this systematic study and why it's important and why I think the PhD project will be particularly powerful is that, one, we're looking at lower mass than we've ever seen before and a wider range than we've ever seen before. But crucially, we're looking at very high statistics. We're looking at a mass distributions up to 200,000 fission counts in them. So, of course, when we're extracting information from our data, we need to fit it. If we have high statistics, we then have a high degrees of certainty to our fit. Great. So, what is the big question? Let's have a quick drink. So the big question, obviously, is trying to work out what's causing actinide fission and what's causing sublead nuclei fission in this way. Oh, sorry, right. So, as I said, let's summarize what this systematic study is and what I'll be doing in my PhD. So we're going to lower mass than previously seen, measured before, and we're going for very high statistics as well. One of the benefits of our experimental setup at ANU with both the accelerator and the Q spectrometers, we can manage to do both of these relatively easily. Okay, so this means that we should really have the ideal data set to answer the big question, kind of the main question I want to have answered, or at least make significant progress towards in my thesis, which is what shell effects dictate the fission process? Okay, and quickly to summarize, I also want to have a take-home message, sort of things that if you can remember any of these points in a week's time, I'll be very happy. Hopefully, I have proven to you that fission is indeed an extremely complicated and complex reaction. That many nuclei break apart asymmetrically, and anytime this happens, please think in the future that it has to be due to quantum shell effects and their increased stability. And I want to remember that for the Bismuth paper, we saw that the low excitation energy study highlighted there is a rapid evolution in distributions with a small increase in excitation energy above the barrier, and crucially, in nuclei far from the actinide region. This is one of the few studies that is showing categorically there is, again, mass-asymmetric fission, and it is very strong in this region. And that we require wide systematic studies of fission mass distributions, not just in the actinide region, which is now relatively well studied, but also in the sublead region, to hopefully isolate and probe which shell effects are responsible for fission. And just to kind of highlight that this is kind of a very new thought process to use these heavy ion-induced reactions to study fission. It's pretty much in 2015 is where we started at ANU, and hopefully with the systematic study that I'll be doing, we can hopefully get a nice little bow on top of that study. And as I said, the very high statistics study should provide the answer to the big question, which is what shell effects dictate the fission process. Okay, so quickly I want to say thank you very much to my supervisors, both for literally answering every single question I've ever asked, and it's part of my challenge of my PhD is to ask a question you can't answer. And also thank you for not letting me stand up in any photos we've ever had together. And also thank you to one of my other supervisors, Taiki, who is just a fountain of knowledge and just makes me very excited about every single thing I find. And also thank you to Ed and to Steve Timms. And also thank you very much to the rest of my nuclear reactor dynamics group, which has had to suffer through putting up with me on a night shift many a time, and also for all of their data analysis and help with the data analysis, especially for, say, Ewan and Annette. Thank you very much for that. And of course, the other collaborators on the Bismuth study, so Mark Story from Lawrence Livermore, who was here on sabbatical, and many of the people which you should recognise who were part of this department in the past. Thanks very much.
When you're fitting out massing the distribution of sublead region,
Mass distribution.
That's, yeah. You're comparing them with the Actinide ones, which had a 5 Gaussian fit, and you're only using 3. Is there a reason to not expect different asymmetric modes?
So I think the principle is that in the Actinide region, as I said, after a long period of time, experiments were consistently showing that you have to have 2 different mass-asymmetric modes in the Actinide region. That hasn't really been shown to be the case in the sub-led region. There hasn't been a need to invoke another separate asymmetric fission mode. As we saw in the fits that we have, we can amply describe all of our distribution as with a 3 Gaussian fit. So I don't really know why we haven't checked 5 Gaussian. I think it's that we can't really motivate the need for it right now.
It has the same shell effect as the Actinide region.
Well, so true. If it has the same, so the point is that whilst it might be that there are similar effects that are causing both actinide fission and sub-led fission, we're looking at we're looking at in the actinide region, at least according to Scamps and Cedric's paper, we're looking at something that is purely from the proton octopole correlations, right? But in the sub-led region, it seems actually it's more quadrupole rather than octopole shells that seem to be doing the dominant thing. So it has to again still be proton numbers rather than neutron numbers. So to assume that their fission is exactly the same across this region can't quite be done just yet. So I think we're going to, again, it's to be determined.
Then equals 52, 56, and the top scale in proton. So that would give variable access fission. That's one motivation for getting fission count. If you can see those nodes.
Yeah, Greg, you had a question.
Well, these efficient, saying you've got good statistics, efficient cross section is likely for that.
Well, if
So
you go,
how are you actually winning to get the statistics back?
well, if you go high enough above the fission barrier, you're going to cause it to want to fission. And also, not just that, with the heavy ion reactions, we're inducing angular momentum in the system as well. So that means we should be reducing the fission barrier even further. So we should hopefully be increasing the fission probability.
So that's one of the reasons you use the sulfur beam in all these cases.
Yes. And we've also done, which I still need to analyze, we've done a whole set of reactions with magnesium beam as well. So we're hoping, obviously, you want to have other momentum induced, but you can hopefully still get something similar with the magnesium beam as well.
So is your actual fission cross section comparable with actinide?
I can't answer that. I'm not sure. I haven't determined the actual cross sections.
Balance between statistics and cross section. So the cross section is falling exponentially very fast. And the shell effects look down here. Seems as though they jump less quickly. So there's a kind of sweet spot where you've got enough cross section, you've got enough shell effect, and that's where you get the most information.
How do you know where to go?
And
Oh,
Yeah, so we sweep the energy across the road and we go, oh, well, now we're getting a good fission rate and still getting, not getting, receiving high statistics without having the problem of being washing out the mass-asymmetric fission. So if we go to a high energy, we'll start seeing something that is purely symmetric probably, and we'll not have any information to get.
So for each of these combinations, you're actually tuning it every time.
Yes. Yeah. So we're choosing where we find, as David said, the sweet spot. We want to get high statistics, but also still probe these shell effects because we can get very good statistics of fission if we just blast the nucleus to pieces. But we want to be able to find a balance between that. So, yeah. And Andrew, you had a question?
You're seeing evidence that it's proton shell effects that are dominating in both cases. Do you have any ideas on why that is? Is it when the protons are in a different shell to the neutrons?
Yeah.
There'll be fewer orbits in the proton shell. Is it just where you land with your proton and neutron numbers in the fission fragments, where the thermal surface of the fission fragment lands in the shell, which you have to think about not just in, you have to think about in this deformation space.
Yeah.
Well,
so when I was mentioning that, I can't answer that effectively because I think that's more of a, as I said, I've been looking mostly at the experimental side, and I'm just introducing the concepts that could be behind this. This is something that's kind of new to me as well a little bit. In terms of why it seems the protons, it just seems there's lots of different studies that are coming out finding that there is a grouping. Same with the actinide region, where we're seeing a grouping in proton number. But I can't quite answer that question to a way that satisfies both of us. Oh, great. There we are. Good answer. That's great. Did anyone else have? Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
I mean, it's partly why you want to write an experimental study in the first one.
Systematic study. You're right. That's what we need. Yeah. Basically, these sort of questions have to be answered, and the way you can do that is expand our data set to test with, let's say.
I mean, if you do it the other way, if it's listening, you might see that. Something else, you might see something else.
Well, hopefully, if you do a large range study, you should hopefully be able to avoid any sort of, oh, well, if we say this, it could be this. We should only have one answer from that, I hope. Any other questions?
Yeah, following on from Matt's question, so you can fit, like, theoretically, you fit an infinite number of Gaussian.
My dream. Yeah.
So why do they actually stop it by and say, oh, there must be two?
So, I mean, you've got to motivate the physics behind it. You can't have an infinite number of fission modes. You can't have an infinite number of nuclei.
Yeah, so do they determine that from?
Well, I think that it was both from the experiments and from the potential energy surfaces that would be calculated at the time. Through both of those, you basically have to come up with a solution that, well, there are two different asymmetric modes from the potential energy surface and that are seen in the experiment. So it's kind of a empirical and theoretical discussion at the same time.
Is it safe to assume that the different fission modes could possibly be due to different type effects?
Yeah, so if you're pulling into, so that's kind of going back to what Greg was talking about earlier, is if you have a different shape to the nucleus, then yeah, you can definitely have a reason for a different shell effect to occur. The nice thing about something like the work Cedric and John Scamps have been doing is that you can invoke these two different groups from the same type of shell effect, from the same shape, but a different proton number. So it's quite a nice, neat result. Good work, Cedric.
I'm wondering related to what Andrew was asking, whether Cedric can separate proton and neutron densities.
Cedric, can you?
He's asleep.
How dare you?
No, with any of what